Good morning again. I start off with that because then I know you're awake if you respond back to it. That's a good start. Who we are as individuals and what we are as a congregation will make all the difference in the world on whether some people make it to heaven or not. I'm thinking particularly of some people I have in mind who are struggling at the very best to try to hold on. And the places that they have for their encouragement are not encouraging at all. And I wonder what God thinks as He looks down upon His people. As individuals in our efforts, in our private matters, and as a congregation. For again, who we are as individuals and what we are as a congregation will make all the difference in the world to some, whether they make it to heaven or not. And so, as we've been talking for these last several weeks about habits of successful Christian living, it basically will determine our destiny. But it'll also impact our children's destiny and those within the congregation. Because we have an influence outside of who we are as individuals. We have that circle of influence of those that are near us, and a larger area of influence of those that we are somewhat close to, and that would be within the congregation, or our friends, or the people we might associate with, just on an occasional basis. But again, who we are and how we interact with one another will make all the difference on whether they make it to heaven or not. And so, what I've been talking about, I feel like is extremely important. Number one, because it's based within the Scriptures, but it's put together in such a way that it really has made a big difference in my life on how I go about trying to do things. So we've been talking about these habits, and today's habit, by the way, is having a win-win philosophy. And we'll get that in degrees here in just a moment. But if you'll remember, for our first three habits, those were inward habits. Habit number one talks about being proactive. Again, reminding you that the things out there shouldn't determine on how we behave. We make our own decisions of who we are and what we'll believe and what we will do. And then number two, that we begin with the end in mind. That I have my goals, I have my ideas of what I want to do for the year, and I have my daily things set about that this is what I want to be, and this is where I envision myself being at the end of the line. And so therefore, these are things that I need to work toward to get me there. And I have those things in mind. And daily decisions will interpret and deal with those things. And then number three, going along with that, making first things first. I've decided now that this is what I want to be. I'm proactive at it. Then I've envisioned what I should be doing with God in mind, of course, in His direction. And then I discipline myself. I manage my life. I make those first things first in my life. And I don't allow things to at least edge out or wedge out those things that are of primary importance. Those are inward characteristics, Christian characteristics that lead us in the right direction. Now, we move outward. We talked about this last week in that phase 2. Going from independence to interdependence. We relate to one another in a congregation. God has never called us to be separated and isolated like some hermit in a cave somewhere, but rather as a congregation as we interact with each other and with those around us. When God made man and woman, and first of all, He just had man out there, and His comment was so philosophical in a sense, it's so principled, that it's not good for man to be alone. Now, He was talking about putting together a marriage there in the Garden of Eden. But the point is, it's not good for us as individuals to think, I'm going to manage my Christianity by myself. That's not good for me to even think that way. Not good for me and not good for anybody else. I have to think toward outward. As I build my characters inward, I look also outward. Because I have an interdependence, my relationships. Now, we talked about it last week, and once again, one little question for the kids who ever have the sheet this morning. That the most important ingredient that we put into any relationship, that interdependence, is not what we say, and it's not what we do, but it's what we are. Those habits that we develop as a character. Ephesians chapter 4, as God is talking about how He has put the church together with all kinds of different attributes and different types of individuals. And verse 11 says, so He gave Himself some to be apostles and some prophets and some evangelists and some teachers. In other words, God's put together a variety of different things. And He's done that so that we can equip the saints, as He says in verse 12, for the building up of the church. But this is how it's done, as He talks about this in verse 16. From whom, that is from the church now, or from the Christ rather, the church, the whole body is joined together, knit together by what every joint supplies. You see the interaction that's there. We are joined together. We are knit together. And He's made us that every one of us supplies something into this network. And He's picked you out, strangely enough, with all your different characteristics and abilities, to have a very integral part into this network called the church. And you look at yourself and say, I don't know that I really have that much to put in. Every individual. I remember years ago, we were in Argentina as missionaries, and one of our biggest things was trying to communicate to the United States. Back before computers and internet and all that. And we were trying to put up a large ham radio tower with an antenna on top of it. And it was going to be about 60, 70 feet tall. And we were preachers. You know, we don't know much of what's going on. Little engineering abilities, but not great. So we strapped this tower together, bolted it all, and then proceeded with all our manpower to just lift it straight up. It was going good until about 3/4 the way up, and then something buckled, and it just snapped, just like my elbow was doing in front of you here. And just collapsed, and nearly fell on one of us. And we got back and we looked at what went on, and there was one nut that wasn't attached. We all looked at each other and said, one nut didn't do its work. Okay. Now, the whole antenna was important, but that one nut wasn't there doing its job. And we're all a bunch of nuts. You know that. And God gave us these weird, crazy, different abilities because we all have an important thing to do. We interact with one another. Now, I want us to understand that there's a variety of different ways that we interact with one another. They're called paradigms, or maybe you can call them patterns of human interaction. And because of the society we live in, most of the time, it's a win-lose relationship. Sports and other things are built around this. You know, you have a team that wins and a team that loses. And competitions that are out there for whatever, beauty contest or a job or whatever, you have winners and we have losers. And so losers and winners are winners and losers. And yet, what I want to talk about here as far as relationships are concerned is a win-win relationship. Now, that doesn't always work that way within what we're doing in life. And you can look at the Scriptures and see that. For instance, in Acts chapter 5, when the apostles are being put onto trial, and the Pharisees come up and they say, "We want you to stop teaching about Jesus." Well, there's not where a win-win go. Well, we'll do what you say and we'll kind of slide over here. But they rather say, we must obey God rather than men. In any situation where a relationship puts on the line our relationship with God or our obedience to God or our interpretation of His doctrine and understanding His Word, God always trumps everything. And if it means something loses, then something must lose. David and Goliath in the Old Testament, there was a win-lose situation. It just didn't turn out the way Goliath thought it was going to be. Because God had His hand in it. And yet in relationships within the church, there are quite often times where it can be a win-win relationship. But because of our framework, a lot of times we think, well, somebody has to lose in order for me to win. And because of our selfish ambitions, oftentimes we're striving to be the winners. But it doesn't have to cause somebody else to be the loser. And this is what we're dealing with here. A win-win relationship provides tremendous emotional freedom within the relationship, according to Covey, as we talked about in his book here. It can be established because of personal integrity and how we value ourselves in the process. So I don't fear my relationship being challenged because, number one, I've already established, because of habits 1, 2, and 3, my integrity about what I'm about. Nor do I worry about the relationship because I'm going to work through this thing. And so I'm going to go about it in two ways here. I'm going to have the courage to deal with it the right way and then understand that there's going to be a mutual benefit. So the framework is that the mind and the heart are constantly working on a mutual benefit in relationships. Now look around, because this is what we do in church. We have relationships. We enter the doors together, and we come in and we worship together. We relate together. We work together. We work on projects. We give to a common cause, and we work toward what we are. And everybody is a relationship-centered person, or needs to be. And then you could break that down and say, but each family unit also has that. And their husbands and wives and children and grandparents and extended family. And those are relationships. And all of this applies and focuses on making that better. Which, in the end, makes me better as a Christian. More profitable. Think about this. Paul says it this way in Galatians 2, verse 20. You've heard the verse before. I've been crucified with Christ, but nevertheless I live. But not me, but Christ who lives in me. It's not me anymore. He's looked about this whole relationship thing different between he and Christ. Now, he'll also talk in Philippians from a vantage point of who we are and how we relate to one another. Look at Philippians chapter 3. Just a moment with me. Philippians 2. Verse 5, he says, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. In other words, I'm asking you, Paul says, really he's directing them, to think like Jesus thought. This was his mindset, sometimes we use the word. Who didn't consider himself to be equal with God, robbery by giving it up. You'd say, well, that sounds like he lost. But he didn't lose. His goal was to win, you see, the world. So, verse 7, he made himself of no reputation, took the form of a bondservant, and coming in the likeness of men, and he found himself, verse 8, in the appearance of a man, and he humbled himself even as a man, and he became obedient to the point of death on the cross. That was Jesus' mindset. Now again, he had a different end in mind than most of the world has. But in order for him to win, he had to look about things differently. A win-win situation. Now look over in verses 3 and 4 that lead up to that, and you see what Paul's getting to for us. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than himself. Now we're always watching out for ourselves. So he adds to this in verse 4. Let each of you look out not only for his own interest, but also for the interest of others. He's talking to the church here, and he's telling us that I have to be concerned about these other people's interests. I don't push my way through just to get what I want. Even though I might think it's the best thing, because if it walks on so many people and wounds people and hurts people or runs people off, it doesn't benefit. There's something not right in there. So I'm going to strive in my relationships to make sure that nobody loses while I'm developing what I think is good. And if it does, then maybe I need to go back and think about my motives. But always needs to be a win-win. Again, nothing in mind as far as Scripture's suffering or following or obeying God's Word. And when people are pushing their way in on something that's not right, then you have to stand up for what's right and obey God rather than men. But in so many times in a congregation, there's so many feelings and things happening, we have to consider one another and our feelings. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, as Paul is relating to a church, and boy, what a difficult thing this congregation had, because they were probably, as far as we can read in the New Testament, one of the most studious, affluent, able, spiritually minded people there were out there. But it was more on the line of spiritual gifts than spiritual minded. I guess I should change that too. And so, as they had all these different gifts, they would discuss with one another who was better than the other. Does that not remind you of Jesus and the apostles? And yet, they felt like these gifts were more important than other gifts, and therefore they were better. God must have picked them out because they're better. Look at what he gave them compared to others. And the competition began. And so there's a discussion going on, and Paul comes in and he talks about his rights as an apostle. And so in 1 Corinthians 9, verses 19 down through 23, he says, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more." This is where I'm coming from, Paul says. I've got all these things I can do the way I want. I'm in charge. But I'm not going to treat people that way. On the other side, I'm going to look at this as I'm the servant. Not over, but under. And so he goes through and he talks about all these things. And basically he says, verse 22, we'll wrap it up here. He says, "To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak." Now his winning is different than other people's winning. He's looking toward winning souls, not stepping on people and saying, "I'm better than you." I become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. He gave up the rights of what he could do, relationship-wise, in order to win the souls of people, to encourage, to endear himself in any way he could to win those. If the habit of my thinking is how can I better the relationship, I win in the relationship along with the other person. If it, on the other side, it's what can they do for me better, then I'm losing. Let's go back to that 1 Corinthian letter and we'll see what's talked about. Because as Paul begins to outline this whole thing and all these different gifts and through chapter 12 and how he's put the church together with all these different people, then he says, at the end of chapter 12, he says, now I'm going to show you a more excellent way of running your relationship, basically. And then he starts in chapter 13 with the love chapters, we often call And though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but I have not love, I'm not winning. I'm a sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. And he goes through all of these different things that we could say we're doing to win, and it does nothing and profits nothing. And then he portrays it like this, down in verse 11. When I was a child, what are children? Hold out some candy and give me, give me, give me. They're selfish. I mean, we raise them that way. When they're little bitty, everything they do is just perfect. And they walk and they know everything. I mean, even if they fall in mud, oh, look how cute that mud is on you. Until they get a little bit bigger. But by that time, their mindset is everything's about me. And now we've got to work the rest of their life trying to change that around. So Paul comes at it from this point. He says, when I was a child, I spoke as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. I was immature. I kept thinking everything was about me. But when I became a man, I put away my childish things. Relationships is being able to take this whole thing of it should be about me and what I want and putting it aside. And say, I'm not going to be like a child anymore. I'm an adult. And I'm a tough guy. But I am this way and this is what I want to be. And I want a relationship that